how fracking works, but that it's defined by contaminating groundwater. All you have to ask yourself is, how many deaths have you heard about from fracking? 0. So it's obviously a completely trumped up thing in terms of the focus. And yet how many lives are improved by fracking? Millions and millions and millions. So there's obviously, someone is not framing this debate properly if this is the way people think of fracking. And really, I mean, we can go into the details, but basically, fracking, like anything, has certain risks. And progress requires taking risks. But the biggest risk of all is not taking risks. So with fracking, the risk happens to be incredibly, incredibly small. Because the real risk to water is stuff that's near water. Big surprise. Fracking does not occur near water. It occurs about 6,000 feet below water. So what's the risk to water? Number one risk is Mother Nature, because you just have natural contamination of groundwater by gas and by other things, which is why you've been able to light water on fire forever, for centuries and centuries and centuries. But the real danger is sometimes if you drill what's called the casing improperly at the surface, someone can make a mistake, and it's very, very rare, but it happens. But if we frame it as this is energy growth is essential to human life and happiness, and we have laws protecting, prosecuting when people pollute, and we have ways of dealing with it, but we're not going to allow it to be defined by the chance of something going wrong. And of course, the other side is completely hypocritical, and I point this out only in this context of, if you want to talk about people getting sick and dying, talk about the materials used in solar panels and windmills. I mean, in terms of just horror stories of what happens to the Chinese people who are exposed to those types of materials. But
the rare earth mining.
Yeah, the rare earth mining. Right. But I say that as an aside just to kind of make the point about everything can go wrong. It's not that those should be mined, it's just they should have better laws with regard to that. But in general, hypocrisy pointing out is not the most effective thing. The most effective thing is to have a very clear idea of how amazingly positive your side is, and then to just put the other side in contrast, and try to force them to argue against how amazing fracking is, how amazing tar sands and Keystone are, how many benefits producing oil brings to our lives, how the Industrial Revolution has doubled life expectancy, how everything we take for granted, no one could take for granted 200 years ago. Thanks.
I think it was that good of
I take it for granted.
Were you going to say something?
It seems like there's an ideal that's put out of environment that's sustainable and can do all this, but there's also a component of it that this is what you can do. You can join this organization, you can recycle, you can vote for this bill. And that is another part of the ideal, which is taking action.
Yes.
And an organization of action and people and what to do. And that seems a component of the other side.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's a fantastic point. So it was making the point of how with environmentalism in many of these movements, they use moral narratives. Well, one thing that they do really well is they drive action. Well, they give people means of acting on the moral narrative besides voting. And this is something that, and just what I'm working on in the Center for Industrial Progress, it's a huge issue for us in terms of figuring, because you don't want to do something even here, like I'm handing out a mailing list, so everyone sign up on the mailing list. It's a really cool mailing list and it's free. It doesn't bug you too much. But everything I do should drive action in some way. It's not just, we're here to talk and then we don't do anything. And those guys are amazing they have a huge infrastructure set up where they give you the ideal and they tell you about the problem. It's like, this tiger in this country is threatened and give $5 or send this letter to your congressman. But there's a lot to learn from what they do. And part of why people are so motivated on that side, why they think up all these things, is because they're idealistic, and thus people really want to say, well, how do I take more action? How do we do something positive? But on the right, there's not yet, there's no energy liberation plan out there that, you're writing, there will be. But, you're writing your congressman back, you're like, oh my gosh, the freedom to frack, it can revolutionize America, we're going to have a proper nuclear policy. But that will happen, and that's my interest in this in Center for Industrial Progress. But you're absolutely right that that's a huge component of it. So the moral narrative, as I mentioned, is just, it's one aspect, and it's sort of a high level aspect. But there's a whole infrastructure of how you deal with it. And part of the infrastructure is all talking to your friends, spreading literature. And once you understand that these narratives are important, if you see literature that does a really good job of it, that's something you really want to spread. That's one example. If you see a politician who seems really good at reframing the issues properly, he's potentially one to support. So at least I find it very helpful in just watching how effective people are. And then since I'm a professional activist, it obviously can guide me a lot more. I won't pretend that was for me. But you really, it's fun. It starts to be fun, like how creative you can be. I mean, you can use slogans. Yes, slogans take a while. Yeah, they have drill, baby, drill. So I'm not the biggest fan. See, I like build, baby, build, because it's basically illegal to build anything in this country anymore. Or just like talk about like the freedom to frack, or one of our favorites is the idea that because of environmental laws today, you know, the gap between idea and implementation is so big, as against in the computer industry where it's instantaneous. So you basically have like computers at the speed of thought and industry at the speed of government. And what we want is industry at the speed of thought. So that's one of our core expressions is industry at the speed of thought, because that's what industrial progress is. So it's something you can be really creative with, and as long as you tap into that, that liberty and the products of liberty are really good, and that if people really understood them in the right way, they would be really enthusiastic about that. And I personally love, do we want to be this or do we want to, because the other side uses it really well. So I just will say, like, you know, do we want to be a society where manufacturing is welcome, or a society where manufacturing is practically illegal? And yeah, exactly. But people don't say that enough, and we can, and it's powerful. And this goes to an issue of like philosophy and how people hold ideas. So, you know, my grounding is in objectivist philosophy, which is Ayn Rand's philosophy. So I'd say, well, I have a consistent philosophy on these issues. I'm pro-liberty, pro-individualism across the board. And often people coming from that perspective, it can seem frustrating. Well, not everyone agrees with our entire philosophy, and therefore, you know, it can be hard to communicate. But everyone in America has a partially, almost everyone, not Noam Chomsky, but has a partially individualistic element in their philosophy. So there's always something that you can appeal to, certainly in the population at large. And so part of what constructing a moral narrative is you're helping move their general philosophy in a certain direction by showing them what the right philosophy to have in a particular issue is. And the other side is very good at using their philosophy to frame all these issues. The point is, if you have a better philosophy, you can use that to frame all the issues. And once you boil it down to the individual's life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and things like technology and progress, if you can frame it that way, very hard to find people who oppose you. And if you want to know when someone is succeeding, one of the tests I've come up with, just from experience, one guy showed me this. I felt fortunate to have succeeded in this way. There's this environmentalist in the audience, and I could tell I had succeeded with making the point about nuclear and oil when he started acting like a conservative. And by that I mean, he said, like, well, I'm not against all nuclear. I'm not against all oil. I'm just against some. And this is the kind of guy in another context who's just been, oil is evil, nuclear is evil, we got to move toward green. And because I had shredded that whole idea and portrayed it as you're anti. If you want to be for progress, you have to embrace the cheap, plentiful, reliable energy. Right now, that's overwhelmingly fossil fuels. So you can't be pro-fossil fuels and pro-progress. Because that had been so entrenched, he had to be like a compromiser. And that's the position we want to be in. So there's nothing inherent about the wrong position that makes it more effective. Now, I think historically, because we had certain anti-individualist philosophies that moved us away from the Founding Fathers, the tendency in the society was for those narratives to win because those were the intellectuals who dominated. But those of us who aren't on that side can be very good at framing these narratives, and you know, as members of the public, you can frame the narratives, and you can talk to, to the extent you have influence over think tanks or you support people, you can talk to them about it. And having this issue in mind is very powerful in making decisions and in just thinking about what can you do, what can other people do, how do I assess how my own side is doing. So that's pretty much all I want to say. I want to have plenty of time to talk. The main thing I'll say is I'm working on this in the field of energy in industry. If anyone wants to volunteer, help, or correspond, I'm very easy to reach. Capitalism.com. Sign up for the email list. Find me on Facebook. We can use tons more help. But if you're interested in another field, I hope you just think about this issue in that field. And certainly, if I can ever be of help, email me, use me as a resource. Because part of the reason I'm giving talks like this, which is not an energy talk per se, is because I think that we need to have a division of labor, and it's enough to do this in my own field. But if anyone in the other fields like healthcare and finance, all these things need to be reframed. And the healthcare is a nightmare, how it's framed right now. It's basically like, if you're for freedom in healthcare, you want to throw sick people out on the streets and watch them die.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah, but there are ways, we can talk about how to counter that.
No, only if they want to do that.
Yeah, well, but there are ways to reframe this for everything, and I think if you work with it and think about it, it's hopefully we'll see going forward that this is something that our side does more and more and more. And you'll start seeing people, you'll see them in public, you'll see them on TV, and they'll really start winning in ways that hasn't happened nearly as much in the past. So with that, let's take some questions. Yes?
Well, stating a great question. When I talk to people, most people I talk to, I'm getting increasing amount of Luddites who just totally against technology no matter what. They just, an hour is just trying to get them over that.
Well, can I ask a question about that?
Yeah.
So how do they start with I'm a Luddite?
Well, in other words, most of those.
No, but I'm curious how they frame it.
But what they say is, I think the problem is technology. That's the first thing they said. They're holding an iPhone, but they say technology is the problem.
Okay, and then what do they elaborate?
Well, they say that we have too much technology, people not talking to each other. I tell them that technology, that people talk to each other more, because now we have social networks, and they go, oh yeah, right.
But do they want a law about?
They just think it's interrupting communication with people. They just think it's like separating people. Keep people in a home by themselves and that type of thing. Of course, I have arguments against all that, but it takes a long time. Even at the end of the conversation, they agree with it, and they talk the next day, they're back to it again. They just stick to it no matter what. It's all emotional against technology. It's just, I don't know.
Yeah, so that's both aspects of that are interesting. But so there's this interesting aspect of what you're saying about people complaining about technology. So there's a real point in philosophy that as a society evolves physically and technologically, it needs to evolve spiritually as well. And there are many ways, and this is a big point of mine, in which Western civilization did not evolve spiritually properly, and in many ways is unfit for the technologies and even the political institutions that it has. So let's just, at the risk of upsetting some people, let me talk about email for a second, which I think is one of the most abused and sometimes destructive technologies. So when the phone first came out, people complained about it, because they're like, I can't get anything done, because people are calling me on the phone all the time. We used to schedule appointments or send letters, which I could read whenever I wanted. This is interrupting me. And it's true that if you just introspect a little bit psychologically, or if you ever take time off phone and email, you'll see that your ability to think dramatically goes up. I mean, you cannot write real, good stuff, real comma good stuff. That wasn't grammatical. You can't write that kind of stuff with just getting scammed all the time. And this guy has this idea, and here's this credit card offer. And it can become addictive. I mean, it has many addictive qualities, and one becomes in a reactive mode. The whole phenomenon of multitasking has elements. So the point is that it's very technology as such is it's a positive direction, but people need to know how to use it well. And it doesn't come with a guarantee that people will use it for what it's beneficial for, and not for it's not. So I think I use email pretty well now, but because I'm aware of the pitfalls, I get tremendous benefits. And I just said to everyone here, email me. What if it had been, well, smoke signal me if you need me, or call me. Then it's just I have to take calls all the time, or snail mail me. You're gonna have to write a letter, and it's nothing's gonna happen. There's such an upside, but then there's a downside. So the way I would put that is if someone points out a real negative use, I say, yeah, people use it incorrectly, so we need education. So you should start like a smartphone rational happy usage class. But I always bring it to how I think about the situation. So part of how I think about freedom is, yes, people can make wrong decisions, and those who are interested in those wrong decisions can take an educational role, or they can offer some service where they offer to even hold your smartphone for you for a week, or who knows, or people can do all kinds of crazy arrangements. And I do this with everything, like socialized medicine. If Paul Krugman and all these other rich guys think it's a good idea to have socialized medicine, they can just set up a bunch of contracts themselves and make a whole socialized commune of healthcare, and then see how that goes. But they can't coerce me. You can do it with the monetary system. You can choose the Bernanke standard, or you can choose free banking and gold, and see how it goes. So it's again, you think about how do I think of this, and we should never feel like any fact is somehow against freedom. There's no such thing as a fact against freedom. It's just a question of understanding how it fits in. And freedom is not a guarantee that everyone gets to be happy or everyone does the right thing. Freedom is primarily about you and me and everyone else, that we get to do the right thing to the best of our ability and enjoy our lives to the best of our ability. And other people making mistakes is a very secondary issue. I mean, I want to help them avoid making mistakes, particularly in policy, but it's their lives. And I think if you really value your life, you have just a very strong sense of, yeah, it's my life. Yeah, he's making a bunch of dumb decisions, but I hope he does better because it's his life. And again, if you assert something like that, like I own my own life, it's really hard for someone to come up to you and say, no, you don't. Because it sounds an awful lot like slavery.
Yeah.
Yes?
It's just his comment on technology just made me think of the general point that I feel like, on some issues we're fighting the right, on some other issues we're fighting the left. I think in technology in general we're fighting both sides, because the left says don't mess with nature, like they've made Mother Nature a god and other things like that. And then the right says don't mess with the Christian God or whatever, don't play God and stem cells and all that. So I feel like both sides are against what we're for, and fortunately I'm not sure how much they realize they agree. Maybe they
They're starting to though.
Yeah.
It's like, what would Jesus drive? And
yeah. So anyway, it's just a general. You're talking about fighting a particular side, and I feel like on the general issue of technology, we're actually fighting two sides.
Yeah, in a sense, you're fighting for one thing, right? I mean, ultimately, you want the law to reflect what you believe, or what I believe. So I'm fighting these guys, but so right now they're the dominant players in the debate. I acknowledge I'm losing, but still, the most constructive thing I can do is think about how do I convince the American people of a pro-technology policy. And it's helpful to know in terms of knowing your enemy and knowing what things that both of them come from primitive religions. I mean, the environmentalism is just. I mean, primitive religions worship animals and nature because they don't understand how the world works. I mean, it's just a modern version of that. So that can be helpful, but the main thing is, so I can tell them that. But if I lead with a green audience with, hey, you're just a disciple of, people who worship monkeys, that's probably not going to go over so well. But usually they have some element of pro-technology in addition to their anti-technology, and I can try to cash in on that and then really draw stark contrast. Like, what you call promoting green technology really means destroying the technology that works to produce energy in favor of stuff that doesn't. That also happens to be quite primitive in terms of, say, windmills. Yes.
One of the things I run into is the green people that say, well, if we went back to this point in time, And so I brought it down to, well, how many billion years do you want to go back? 3 billion.
Well, you can't go many billions for
3 billion years back, the Earth was nothing but a rock.
Uh-huh.
Is that where you want to start?
But where is it, like a hunter-gatherer type thing, like they have all this recreational time to play tennis and wander the universe
Be full employment.
and cannibalize each other and have periodic famines? I mean,
To make the point, I'd like to just go back 100 years and show that the 99% now have more than the 1% had then.
yeah,
That's right.
yeah.
You've got
and-
cell phones, they had none. You know?
That's a good type of point. I mean, with some stuff like that, it is, so part of the moral narrative is often there's this concept of morality is like it's just this, morality is one field and then economics is another field and science is another field. And actually morality is kind of a more fundamental field because it's about how fundamentally do you act in life. And that needs to be informed by economics and science and just what are the facts. So it's nice to know, like, well, what were the facts about hunter-gatherers and what were, so in the book I'm working on, The Story of Energy, I talk a bit about what it was like for hunter-gatherers and energy. It's not too good. But, and I guess this goes to the broader issue of having an impact. There's many more things than this that are needed to make an impact. And one thing we're working on, which I think is a category that's helpful too, so if anyone is in another field, you should do this. It's a category I call the go-to resource. So imagine, you have someone ask you a question about global warming, right? Like, don't we need to stop coal, ban coal because of global warming? Now, unless you're sort of a trained expert who answers this every day as your obsession and you really like figuring out the exact right way to answer this, you're probably not going to be able to give the greatest answer. And what's more, it's hard to find the right thing to refer someone to, for various reasons. There's a lot of long books, there's a lot of articles, but most articles and resources for various reasons, which are complicated, are not really written to directly address like one issue at a time or one question at a time. So I've become very in favor of FAQs or encyclopedia type things where you have like, here's how to think about global warming. Like, here are the basic facts, but more, here's how to think about it, here's how I frame it. And so one project we're working on is called the Industrial Encyclopedia. And it's basically a go-to resource. So, at a certain point in a couple of years, any issue that comes up like this, you'll be able to go to global warming and get a really good essentialized thing with really clear examples and references, and then it'll link to lots of other aspects. So it might be like global warming economics, or climate gate controversy, hockey stick, and it can be really helpful to. You need to know the facts, along with the principles, and not just. Particularly, you need to know part of having a narrative, a proper narrative, is you need to know the true facts about the world. So, sight unseen, you don't know how CO2 emissions impact climate unless you know something about, or the likelihood of different scenarios, unless you know what is the greenhouse effect. That's a very helpful thing to know. What does catastrophic global warming depend on? Like, what is consensus? What is science by consensus? All of these things, at least in my own experience, as I understand the individual issues, it's very empowering. And I think, wow, I spent all this time, how can I download what I know and then download the best people that I know? How can we download that all on in a way that's super easy to digest? And so I wish that happened with healthcare, for instance, because there's so much in healthcare that comes up where I know the general principles of it, but there's so much like history and specific things that I don't have good access to. So I think when people are writing needs to be, a lot of modern writing is, someone's going to hate me if they see this, but a lot of people are going to hate me, but a lot of writing comes out of the novel. Like in terms of it's you write essays, you write op-eds, they're kind of like non-fiction novels. It's not clear to me that that's always the best thing. Those are really good for storytelling, and storytelling is really, really valuable. But in terms of making abstract points, I really like very straightforward. Like, here's the issue, here's the problem, here's the solution, here's the just right down the middle. So I wish there were more resources like that. Yes.
So just in terms of this point of framing, I'm a third-year law student, and I had the pleasure of spending some time at the Institute for Justice over.
Oh, okay, yeah, those are great.
Yeah, no, and what people were in the whole organization, because I thought of it as being very lawyer-driven, litigation, and you go to court and you fight that out. But they had this thing, SACOs, which is sort of is a military almost acronym, is Strategic Overriding Communication Objective. And it was basically this idea that for whatever the case was, there would be like 2 or 3 key points that in any media contact that would be gotten across, and it would be like a sentence or two to try and sort of manage the narrative. And one of them really stuck with me. There was this case where these Benedictine monks in Louisiana had this practice of making caskets, which they sold, and it was a long-standing practice. And the state came in and said, oh, well, you know, really, you're only supposed to sell caskets if you have a funeral director's license. And it's this whole big, like, multi-year, all these education requirements and hoops and all this junk. And so the main SACO there was, it's a box. It's a goddamn box. And that's the sort of thing that, you know, regardless of how the case comes out, in terms of the public opinion and the impression, you know, it's like even if they lose, they win, because you get this message across that, like, well, they're stopping these monks from selling the box. That seems silly, and people get a little more skeptical about these regulations.
And notice it's a philosophical, I have a bunch of friends there, it's a philosophical organization, so it's not just like, oh, that's a spin, but it's what's very good about it is it's a really good way of highlighting how flagrant it is to tell someone what to do with his life. They're just saying, like, you're not allowed to make a box in America, and that's fantastic. So yeah, and that's another example. I think it's perhaps the best one today in terms of just, if you look at, for instance, what they did with the eminent domain case, the Kelo case, Suzette Kelo. I mean, they lost that case in court, and yet in public opinion, they got laws passed against eminent domain in state after state after state after state. By really, and notice they trace it to an individual's life. They tell a story, they have a narrative about an individual, and it's your dream home. This is a real American dream, not a Fannie Mae American dream, as far as I know. You know, like a real American dream, and someone is saying, you can't have your house because we think the public interest requires this office building. And the point is, are we in a country where it's your life? Or, you know, as soon as there's enough money in someone's hands, it's your life and your everything you value, does that mean nothing?
It still hasn't been developed, by the way.
Oh, it's a wonderful example. The house is a monument now, and yeah, they didn't develop it, and they have the house there, you can visit, I mean.
Oh, really?
Yeah, oh, you didn't know it.
I didn't know that.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
like ongoing support.
There is
Oh, it's sitting there, yeah, they didn't develop it, and it's marvelous.
Yes.
One of the powerful things that seems to be for environmentalists is this ritual markers, ritual of recycling, and these markers on this refrigerator saves so much energy. And these are daily things that people can identify and incorporate in their own thinking.
Yeah.
And it's very powerful when the message comes through, and then they identify with their own life. And there used to be companies like GE who said, we bring good things to life, but this has been sort of discredited as corporate PR. And so there's not like these markers out there that people can see in their everyday life that make it really powerful when the message comes through.
There's not yet go industrial markers on everything. That is a project. I mean, but yeah, part of it is that what happens is once you've got this broader narrative, a lot of people need to have a sense of, am I doing the right thing or not? And if this is the right thing, then lots of smart, creative people will find ways to popularize that. And so much of what, if I thought of like the green movement in terms of what can I personally do to counter every little clever thing they do, I would quit because there's so many. But it's by being decentralized in the proper way, and by giving people certain ideas, and by putting out certain content, by modeling certain approaches, you know, really, I can't do web video very well, but I'm hoping that, you know, I'll give a lecture on fracking, and someone will hear how amazing it is, and they'll make a web video on fracking, and or I'll talk about just industrial products, and they'll come up with some clever slogan to put on a refrigerator. So that's one aspect. One thing that is an implication of